The mathematics teacher from Scranton found his grandfather's field notebook in a cardboard box marked Army Don't Open 3 days after the funeral, and what he read on page 17 made him call the Army Historical Division within an hour, because the story couldn't possibly be true, except that it was. Michael Kowalski had never met his grandfather Stanley. The old man had died in 1987 when Michael was 2 years old, and the family didn't talk about him much. Michael's father would just say that Grandpa Stan had been in the war, came home different, worked at the steel mill for 30 years, and died of a heart attack at 62. Standard story for that generation. Nothing special. Nothing worth examining. But clearing out his grandmother's house in October 2019, Michael found the box. Inside were dog tags, a bronze star in a presentation case that had never been opened, photographs of young men in paratrooper uniforms, and a small leather notebook with S. Kowalski, 82nd Airborne, written inside the cover. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but still readable. Most of it was mundane, duty rosters, supply lists, addresses of buddies, but page 17 was different. The handwriting changed there, got shakier, more urgent. The entry was dated September 21st, 1944. It read, "Yesterday, the 504th crossed the river. We thought the worst was over. Today, the SS came back with tanks. We'd been firing all morning, 70 rounds gone by noon. By late afternoon, ammunition situation was critical. Final German push came at 16:30 hours. 6 Panthers, coordinated attack, professional tactics. Lieutenant Hendricks wanted me to start shooting at 800 yards. I told him we need to wait for proper range. He said we don't have time. I said we don't have ammunition to waste on shots that won't penetrate. We argued for maybe 20 seconds while those tanks got closer. 700 yards, 600. I could see the Balkenkreuz on their hulls. I could see the tank commanders in their hatches. Hendricks was screaming for me to shoot. But I knew the ballistics. I knew the penetration values. I knew that at 800 yards we might not punch through the glacis. At 500 yards we would. So I waited. And when I finally fired at 480 yards, that round went through the lead Panther's frontal armor, and the whole thing brewed up. We killed 4 tanks total before they pulled back. Bridge held. Hendricks said I saved the bridgehead. Maybe I did. But for the rest of my life, I'll see those 20 seconds. How close those tanks got. How many men would have died if the math had been wrong. Michael read it 3 times. Then he Googled 82nd Airborne Nijmegen, September 21st, 1944, SS counterattack. What he found explained everything. The famous river crossing had happened on September 20th, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment paddling across the wall in canvas boats under murderous fire to capture both ends of the bridge. But the Germans hadn't given up. On September 21st and 22nd, elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division launched desperate counterattacks trying to retake the bridge. The Americans held by the thinnest of margins, with anti-tank guns positioned around the bridgehead firing until they ran completely dry. And somehow, Michael's grandfather had been there with one of those guns, making a calculation about armor penetration and engagement ranges that might have saved everything. Michael called the Army, got transferred 3 times, finally reached a historian at the 82nd Airborne Division Museum at Fort Bragg. I'm trying to verify a story about my grandfather, Stanley Kowalski. He was with the 82nd at Nijmegen in September 1944. Apparently he was part of an anti-tank gun crew that— "Hold on," the historian interrupted. "Kowalski. S. Kowalski. Gunner. Battery C, 80th Airborne Antiaircraft and Antitank Battalion. Yeah, we have records." He was awarded the Bronze Star for actions on September 21st, 1944, during the defense of the Nijmegen bridgehead. The citation mentions exceptional skill and courage in the employment of anti-tank weapons against enemy armor. There are after-action reports that reference a 57-member gun crew that knocked out a Panther at point-blank range during one of the SS counterattacks. Is that what you're asking about? He wrote in his notebook that ammunition was critically low and he had to decide when to fire. That he argued with his lieutenant about waiting for the right range. The historian was quiet for a moment. That would fit. September 21st was brutal. The Germans threw everything at that bridgehead. The anti-tank guns were critically low on ammunition. Most had already been knocked out or overrun. If your grandfather's crew was down to their last few rounds, he paused. The 57mm Mao 1 was a good gun, but against a Panther you needed to be close. Real close. Under 500 yards for reliable frontal penetration. Closer was better, so yeah, waiting for the right range despite pressure to fire. That's the difference between killing a tank and wasting precious ammunition. What would have happened if he'd missed? If that tank column had broken through, the bridgehead would have collapsed. Maybe not immediately, but without anti-tank defenses, the SS would have rolled up the American positions. Everyone who'd crossed the river the day before, hundreds of paratroopers, they'd have been cut off and destroyed. The bridge would have been lost. Operation Market Garden would have failed even faster than it did. Michael spent 3 days researching after that call. Read books, watched documentaries, studied the maps and after-action reports. And the more he learned, the more he understood why his grandfather had never talked about it. Because the mathematics were terrifying. Limited ammunition, 6 Panther tanks, 20 seconds to decide the right moment to fire. Get it right and the bridgehead holds. Get it wrong and SS Panzers roll through and slaughter everyone who'd fought their way across that river. That kind of pressure didn't fade just because the war ended. It lived in you forever. He decided to write it down. To reconstruct what must have happened that September day in Holland, based on his grandfather's notebook, the historical record, and the combat reports he could find. This is that story. September 17th, 1944. Nijmegen, Holland. Stanley Kowalski was 23 years old, from Scranton, Pennsylvania, son of Polish immigrants who'd worked in the coal mines. He'd been a steelworker before the war, good with his hands, good with machines and mathematics. When he got drafted in 1942, they'd tested him and put him in the Airborne, made him a gunner on a 57mm military anti-tank gun, which was the American version of the British 6-pounder. The M157mm was a sleek, lethal weapon, a long-barreled cannon designed to punch holes through German armor. 3-inch bore diameter, firing a 6.28-pound armor-piercing shot at 2,900 feet per second. Against a Panther's frontal armor at 500 yards, it could penetrate 3 inches of steel, but you had to be at 500 yards. Any further and the physics stopped working in your favor. Stanley turned out to be very good at it. He understood the mathematics, angle of attack, armor thickness, penetration values at different ranges. He could look at a German tank and calculate in his head whether his gun could kill it from this angle at this distance. That kind of instant mathematics kept you alive in tank country. The 80th Airborne Antiaircraft and Antitank Battalion supported the 82nd Airborne Division. They flew into combat on gliders, big canvas and wood contraptions that got towed behind C-47s, and then crash-landed wherever seemed survivable. It was a terrifying way to go to war. No engines, no armor, just a pilot trying to set down a crate full of men and equipment without killing everyone on board. Stanley had done it twice now, Sicily in 43, Normandy in 44. Each time he swore he'd never do it again. Each time he was wrong. For Operation Market Garden, Stanley's gun crew glided in on the afternoon of September 17th. Their M1 57mm gun broke down into components small enough to fit on a Waco glider, then got reassembled on the ground. Stanley's crew consisted of 6 men. Himself as gunner, Lieutenant Robert Hendricks as gun commander, Corporal James Red Mahoney as loader, Private First Class Eddie Matsumoto as ammunition handler, Private Billy Harper as spotter, and Private Tommy Chen on the radio. 6 men, 1 gun, and 150 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition they'd scrounged from every source they could find. The landing was rough, but they survived it. Glider came down in a field south of Nijmegen, skidded through mud, and stopped. They assembled the gun in 40 minutes and reported to battalion. The mission was clear. The 82nd had to capture the massive highway bridge over the Wall River at Nijmegen. Without that bridge, Operation Market Garden would fail. British tanks couldn't advance. The whole elaborate plan would collapse. But the bridge was heavily defended. The Germans knew exactly how critical it was. For 2 days, September 17th and 18th, the 82nd hammered at German positions while British tanks fought their way north up Hell's Highway. By September 19th, the Americans held the southern approach to the bridge, but the Germans still controlled the north side. Stalemate. British armor couldn't cross under fire. That's when someone proposed an insane solution. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment would cross the Wall River a mile upstream in canvas boats, then attack the German positions from behind. It was suicidal. Everyone knew it was suicidal. 400 yards of open water, German machine guns on the far bank, no cover, no concealment. But it was also the only option left. Stanley's anti-tank gun was positioned on high ground south of the bridge, part of a defensive screen. On September 20th, he watched through binoculars as 260 men paddled across that river under devastating fire. German MG-42s, mortars, artillery, the wall turned red. But they made it. Somehow, impossibly, enough of them made it across to overrun the German positions on the north bank. By nightfall on September 20th, both ends of the Nijmegen Bridge were in American hands. Stanley's gun crew hadn't fired a shot during the crossing. No tanks appeared, and 57mm guns were useless against dug-in infantry. But that night, Lieutenant Hendricks gathered them around. Germans aren't going to accept this. They'll counterattack, probably with armor. So get whatever sleep you can because tomorrow's going to be bad. Hendricks was right. September 21st started at dawn with German artillery pounding the bridgehead. Then came the radio reports. German armor moving toward Nijmegen from the east. Elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division, some of the best troops Germany had left. They were coming to take the bridge back, and they were bringing tanks. By mid-morning, Stanley's crew had fired 70 rounds. Short bursts at German infantry probing the defenses. Harassment fire on suspected tank assembly areas. The 57mm wasn't designed for indirect fire, but in a desperate defensive situation you used what you had. 70 rounds expended. 80 left. The battalion supply officer came around at noon with bad news. Ration your ammunition. No resupply today, maybe not tomorrow. What you've got is all you're getting. Stanley did a mental count. 80 armor-piercing rounds. Against infantry, that was fine. Against tanks, it was terrifying. The 57mm needed multiple hits to guarantee a Panther kill. 1 round might penetrate but not reach anything vital. You needed 2, 3, sometimes 4 good hits. 80 rounds meant maybe 20 tank engagements if they were accurate and lucky. We need to be selective, Stanley told Hendricks. No shooting at unconfirmed targets, no suppression fire. We save every AP round for identified armor. Hendricks nodded. He was 22 years old, ROTC out of Yale, smart kid, but this was only his second major combat operation. Normandy had been his first, and he'd done well enough, but Holland was different. The pressure was different. Think they'll really come with tanks? Sir, they just lost the bridge. That's their main supply route into Western Holland. They'll come. They got confirmation at 1400 hours, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The battalion S3 operations officer came around personally. German armor confirmed moving toward the bridgehead from the east. Estimate 6 to 10 tanks, mixture of Panthers and Panzerviehs with infantry support. ETA 90 minutes. All anti-tank guns prepare for engagement. Red Mahoney looked at the ammunition stacked behind their position. 80 rounds for 6 Panthers. Hell of a math problem, Sarge. We won't face all 6, Stanley said, trying to sound confident. We're 1 gun in a defensive network. We'll get maybe 2 tanks in our sector. But Red wasn't stupid. Sarge, what's left of the defensive network? 2nd Platoon's gun took a direct hit yesterday. 3rd Platoon abandoned their position during the crossing. We're it. If tanks come this way, we're facing them alone. Stanley didn't answer because Red was right. They were effectively the only anti-tank gun covering this approach to the bridge. If SS Panzers came down this road, Stanley's crew would face everything the Germans had. By 1500 hours, they could hear the tanks. That distinctive sound of German armor, the squeal of steel tracks, the roar of Maybach engines. Stanley had learned to identify German tanks by sound. Panthers had a deeper engine note than the smaller Panzer IVs. These sounded like Panthers. Tommy Chen was on the radio, copying traffic from battalion. S3 reports 6 tanks confirmed, moving west on the Groesbeek-Nijmegen road. Speed approximately 20 kilometers per hour. Distance 4 kilometers. 4 kilometers was 20 minutes at that speed, maybe less if they accelerated. Stanley checked the gun, Trevor's smooth, elevation smooth, breech clean, sights aligned, everything ready. He looked at his crew. Red was stacking ammunition for easy access. Eddie was checking the breech mechanism again, even though it was fine. Billy was at the spotting scope, scanning the eastern approaches. Tommy was on the radio. Hendricks stood slightly apart, binoculars raised, watching. They were ready. As ready as you could be to face Panther tanks with 1 medium anti-tank gun and limited ammunition. The first German tank appeared at 1522 hours. Stanley saw it through his sight, just the top of the turret at first, moving between farm buildings about 1,500 yards away. Then more of the hull became visible as it crested a low rise. Panther, no question. 75mm gun, sloped armor, distinctive boxy shape. Target, Hendricks called out. Panther, 11 o'clock, 1,500 yards. Stanley tracked it with his sight. The Panther was hull down, only the turret exposed, moving slowly. Smart tactics. The German commander knew there might be anti-tank guns, so he was advancing carefully, using terrain. Range 1,500, Stanley said. Can't penetrate at this range, need to wait. There's more coming, Billy called from the spotting scope. I count 4, no, 5 tanks, all Panthers, moving in column. 5 Panthers. Stanley felt ice in his stomach. The M157mm could kill a Panther, but you needed the right angle and the right range. Frontal shots required under 500 yards. Side shots you could stretch to 800. But at 1,500 yards, the AP round would just bounce off that sloped armor. We wait, Stanley said. Let them close. The lead Panther advanced. 1,400 yards, 1,300. The other tanks followed, maintaining spacing. Professional, these weren't garrison troops. These were SS Panzer crews who knew their business. Hendricks lowered his binoculars. Kowalski, we need to engage. If we let them get too close, we lose the angle advantage. Sir, at this range, we can't penetrate. We can slow them down, force them to button up and move cautiously. Stanley kept his eye pressed to the sight, tracking the lead Panther. Sir, we've got 120 rounds. If we start shooting now at ineffective range, we'll burn through ammunition and accomplish nothing. We need to wait for killing range. That's an order, Sergeant. Engage at 1,200 yards. The lead Panther was at 1,250 yards now. Stanley's hands were on the traverse and elevation controls. His finger was on the firing button, but he didn't press it. Sir, I'm asking you to trust my judgment on the ballistics. Sergeant, I gave you a direct order. Yes, sir, you did. And I'm respectfully requesting you reconsider based on the technical capabilities of this weapon system. They were having this argument while 5 Panther tanks advanced toward their position, and they had limited ammunition, and the entire bridgehead depended on them stopping those tanks. It was insane. But Stanley had learned something in 2 years of combat. Being alive mattered more than being obedient. And right now, saving ammunition for certain kills mattered more than following orders. Hendricks stared at him. 22 years old, Yale educated, outranked by a 23-year-old steelworker from Scranton who was refusing his orders. Finally, Hendricks said, "How close do you need them?" 500 yards for frontal penetration, sir. 400 is better. Jesus Christ, that's point-blank range for tank guns. Yes, sir, it is. We'll be sitting ducks. Yes, sir, but we'll also kill their tanks. Hendricks looked at the advancing Panthers, looked at his gun crew, looked back at Stanley. All right, we wait. But if they start firing on us at range, then we fire back and hope we get lucky. But I'd rather take 1 shot that kills than 5 shots that don't. The Panthers kept coming. 1,000 yards, 900. Stanley could see them clearly now through his sight, the commanders in their hatches scanning for threats, the long 75mm guns traversing slowly. These were Panther AUSF-Gs, the latest model with the thickest armor. Frontal glossus sloped at 55 degrees. At 1,000 yards, Stanley's AP round would ricochet off that angle. At 500 yards, it would punch through. 800 yards, 700. Red Mahoney was breathing hard. Eddie had stopped checking the breech and was just standing there, hands shaking. Billy kept calling ranges through the spotting scope. 700 yards, 650, 600. The Germans still hadn't spotted them. Stanley's position was on the reverse slope of a low hill, hull down, camouflaged with cut brush. The Panthers were scanning, but they hadn't identified the threat yet. That wouldn't last. Once Stanley fired, they'd see the muzzle blast and return fire immediately. 550 yards. Stanley made a microscopic adjustment to the elevation. The math ran through his head automatically. Muzzle velocity, 2,900 feet per second. Time of flight at 500 yards, roughly 0.5 seconds. Panther moving at maybe 15 kilometers per hour. Lead the target by 3 feet. Aim for the driver's vision port. Weakest point on the glasses. If the round penetrates there, it'll kill the driver and probably detonate ammunition. 500 yards. Ready, Stanley said quietly. Red loaded the AP round. Eddie closed the breech. Billy was glued to the spotting scope. Tommy had stopped copying radio traffic and was just watching. Hendricks stood frozen, binoculars halfway to his face. 480 yards. Stanley fired. The 57mm gun roared and kicked back on its recoil mechanism. The AP round crossed the distance in half a second. Supersonic crack splitting the air. Stanley was already tracking to see the impact. The round hit the lead Panther exactly where Stanley had aimed. Driver's vision port. At 480 yards, the hardened steel penetrator punched through the armor plate like it was cardboard. Inside the tank, the penetrator and the steel fragments it created from the armor plate ripped through the driver's compartment, through the fighting compartment, and struck the ammunition storage in the hull. The Panther erupted in a geyser of orange flame and black smoke. The turret lifted off the hull and crashed back down at an angle. Secondary explosions rippled through the wreck. "Hit!" Billy screamed. "Direct hit! It's burning!" The other 4 Panthers stopped. For maybe 3 seconds they just sat there, commanders probably screaming orders, crews trying to figure out where the shot had come from. Then they started backing up, putting distance between themselves and whatever had just killed their leader. "They're retreating," Red shouted. "We did it!" But Stanley was already doing math in his head. 4 Panthers left. 119 rounds of ammunition. They'd stopped this attack, but the Germans would regroup and try again. And next time they'd know where the American gun was positioned. "Cease fire," Hendricks ordered. "Let them go. Chen, get on the radio. Report 1 Panther destroyed, 4 retreating east." Stanley kept his eye on the sight, tracking the retreating tanks until they disappeared behind terrain. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline dump after the shot. Red was laughing with relief. Eddie was slapping Billy on the back. Tommy was frantically copying radio traffic. Hendricks walked over to Stanley. His face was pale. "You were right about the range. If we'd fired at 1,200 yards, we'd have wasted rounds, and they'd have known we were here. I almost forced you to shoot too early." "Yes, sir, you did." Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for refusing my order." Stanley didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and went back to checking the gun. They had 20 minutes before the Germans came again. This time, there were 6 tanks, the 4 Panthers from before plus 2 more they'd brought up from reserve. And this time, they weren't advancing in a column on a road. They were spread out using terrain, moving tactically. The German commander had learned from his mistake. Stanley watched them through his sight. They were approaching from the northeast now, different axis of attack, trying to get around the flank. Smart. But it meant longer range before they'd be in killing position. The crew had fired 40 more rounds in the last 20 minutes, harassing fire on German infantry trying to support the armor, suppression fire on German positions that were firing at them. Down to 80 rounds now. 80 rounds and 6 Panthers. "They're going to split up," Stanley told Hendricks. "Try to hit us from multiple directions at once. We can't cover all the approaches. So, what do? We pick the most dangerous threat and kill it. Hope that makes the others cautious." The Panthers advanced. 1,200 yards, 1,900, still out of effective range. Stanley waited. His crew was exhausted now. They'd been in continuous combat for 6 hours. Red's hands were shaking so badly he could barely load rounds. Eddie had burns on his forearms from handling hot brass. Billy's voice was hoarse from calling ranges. Tommy's radio handset was slick with sweat. 800 yards. Still too far for a reliable frontal shot. The Panthers were hull down now, exposing only their turrets, making themselves harder targets. Then German artillery opened up, probably 150 meters guns from somewhere to the east. Shells started landing around Stanley's position. Not a full barrage, just harassing fire, but enough to make life hell. The ground shook with each impact. Dirt and shrapnel flew through the air. "They're trying to suppress us!" Hendricks yelled over the explosions. "Keep us from firing while their tanks advance." Stanley stayed on the gun. A shell landed 30 yards away, and the blast wave nearly knocked him over. His ears rang. But he stayed on the gun, kept tracking the lead Panther through his sight. 700 yards, 600. The artillery fire intensified. A shell landed close enough that the overpressure felt like being punched in the chest. Red was cowering behind the gun shield. Eddie had his hands over his head. Billy had abandoned the spotting scope. 550 yards. Stanley couldn't see the target clearly anymore. Too much smoke and dust in the air from the artillery impacts. He was firing by instinct now, by memory of where the Panther had been 3 seconds ago, calculating where it would be now. 520 yards. "Fire!" Hendricks screamed. "Adjusting!" Stanley screamed back. Not yet, not quite yet. The smoke was clearing slightly. He could see the Panther's turret again. 500 yards. Close enough. Stanley fired. The round flew through the smoke and dust, through the artillery impacts across 500 yards of Holland farmland, and struck the Panther's turret ring, the junction between turret and hull, a weak point in the armor. The AP round punched through and detonated the ammunition stored in the turret bustle. The turret exploded upward in a spectacular fireball. Hit. Billy's voice was hoarse but triumphant. Another kill. 5 Panthers left. 79 rounds of ammunition. The battle went on, and on. The Germans kept coming. Sometimes in force, sometimes just probing attacks to test the defenses. Stanley's crew fired and fired, every shot calculated, every round precious. By 1600 hours, 4 o'clock, they were down to 23 rounds. The gun was hot, the barrel smoking after continuous fire. Red's hands were raw from loading. Eddie had burns on his forearms from handling hot brass. Billy's voice was hoarse from calling ranges. Tommy's uniform was soaked with sweat from copying frantic radio traffic. The Germans regrouped and attacked again. 4 Panthers this time with infantry support. Stanley engaged at 520 yards, hit. The Panther slewed sideways, track destroyed. 22 rounds left. The Panthers spread out, trying to flank the position. Stanley fired again. Miss. The round ricocheted off the sloped armor at a bad angle. 21 rounds left. Another shot. Hit. A Panther's turret ring, weak point, and the turret traverse jammed. The tank was mission-killed, couldn't fight effectively. 20 rounds left. The German infantry was getting closer now, using the tanks for cover. Stanley had to shift fire, suppression rounds at the infantry, forcing them back. 15 rounds left. Stanley fired twice more in quick succession. First shot, hit. A Panther's track blown off, the tank slewing sideways and stopping. 14 rounds. Second shot, hit. Another Panther's engine compartment, flames and black smoke pouring out. 13 rounds. Third shot. Glancing hit on turret armor, no serious damage. 12 rounds. By 16:15 hours, the attack broke. The Germans pulled back again, leaving 2 Panthers smoking on the field. But they'd be back. They always came back. And now Stanley was down to 12 rounds. Tommy Chen was monitoring multiple radio nets, his face pale. Battalion reports another formation assembling to the east. Looks like 6 tanks, maybe more. 12 rounds, 6 or more tanks. The mathematics were getting impossible. The next attack came at 16:25 hours. 6 Panthers moving in coordination, infantry close behind. This was a serious push. Organized, determined. The kind of attack that would break through if it wasn't stopped. Stanley engaged. 540 yards fire. Hit. Panther immobilized. Smoke from the engine compartment. 11 rounds. Fire. Miss. Target moved at the last second. 10 rounds. Fire. Hit. Another track kill. 9 rounds. The Panthers were getting closer now. 400 yards, 350. Close enough that Stanley could see details. The commanders in their hatches, the infantry running alongside, the muzzle flash when the Panthers returned fire. A German 75mm round screamed past, missing by 20 feet. Then another, closer. The Panthers had identified Stanley's position. Now it was a duel, fire, hit, turret ring penetration. The Panther brewed up, internal ammunition cooking off. 8 rounds. Fire, miss, another ricochet. 7 rounds. Fire, hit, but only a glancing blow, no serious damage. 6 rounds. The Germans were at 300 yards now. Close enough that if they overran the position, Stanley's crew would have to fight them with rifles and grenades. But if Stanley pulled back, the bridgehead would collapse. Fire. Hit, driver's vision port, perfect shot. The Panther lurched to a stop. 5 rounds. And now it was 16:30 hours, and Tommy Chen was copying urgent radio traffic. Battalion reports final German push forming up. All available tanks. This is it. Stanley looked at his remaining ammunition. 5 armor-piercing rounds. 5. He looked at Hendricks. The lieutenant looked back at him. Neither said what they were both thinking. After these 5 rounds, they'd be empty. And if the Germans still had tanks after that, the bridgehead would fall. The Panthers that had pulled back were regrouping. Stanley could see them through his sight. Maybe 4 operational Panthers left from all the attacks, plus 2 more that had just arrived as reinforcements. 6 Panthers for the final push. 5 rounds against 6 tanks. "We make every shot count," Hendricks said quietly. "No margin for error." "No, sir, there isn't." The Panthers advanced. 1,200 yards, 1,100. They were being cautious now, using terrain, moving tactically. They'd learned from the earlier losses. 1,000 yards, 900. Stanley tracked the lead Panther, waited. The shot had to be perfect. 800 yards, 700. "Kowalski," Hendricks said, "whenever you're ready." 600 yards, still too far for guaranteed penetration against the glasses. 550 yards, getting close now. Stanley made microscopic adjustments. Lead the target, account for wind. His hands were steady now, all the exhaustion and fear compressed into cold focus. 500 yards. Stanley fired. The AP round punched through the lead Panther's frontal armor at the driver's vision port. Weakest point on the glasses. Inside, the penetrator and the steel fragments it created killed the driver instantly and struck ammunition storage. The Panther exploded, turret lifting off the hull. 4 rounds left. 5 Panthers. The German column stopped. The commanders were conferring. Stanley could see them in their hatches, probably on the radio. They'd just lost their lead tank. How many more Americans' anti-tank guns were out there? How much ammunition did the defenders still have? The Panthers started moving again, but now they were spreading out, trying to present multiple targets simultaneously. Smart tactics. Stanley couldn't engage them all. Fire, hit, side shot at 600 yards, a Panther's engine compartment. The tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring out. 3 rounds left. 4 Panthers. Fire. Miss. The round passed clean between 2 Panthers without hitting either. 2 rounds left. 4 Panthers. Stanley's hands were shaking now. 2 rounds, 4 tanks. The mathematics were impossible. The Panthers were at 400 yards. Hendricks was on the radio, calling for any support, anything. Artillery, airstrikes, reinforcements. But there was nothing. Everything had been committed elsewhere. Stanley's gun was it. "Fire when ready," Hendricks said, his voice tight. Stanley tracked the nearest Panther. 380 yards, close range. The tank was presenting its side armor now, thinner than the glasses. A good target. Fire. Hit. The round penetrated the side armor and detonated something inside. probably ammunition or fuel. The Panther burned. 1 round left. 3 Panthers. The remaining Panthers stopped again. Stanley watched through his sight as the commanders conferred. They'd just lost 3 tanks to this one position. 3 Panthers in maybe 2 minutes. How much ammunition did the Americans have left? The German commanders couldn't know. All they knew was that every time they advanced, American AT guns killed their tanks. The lead Panthers started backing up, then the others followed. Slowly at first, then faster. They were retreating. Not a rout, a tactical withdrawal. The German commanders had decided that taking this bridge wasn't worth losing more tanks today. Stanley kept his eye on the sight, tracking them until they disappeared behind terrain. His hands were shaking so badly now he could barely hold the controls. "They're pulling back," Billy whispered, voice hoarse with disbelief. "They're actually pulling back." 1 round left, 1 AP round sitting in the ammunition rack. If the Germans had known, if they'd pressed the attack for 30 more seconds, if they'd called Stanley's bluff. But they didn't know, they couldn't know. All they knew was that this position was killing their tanks, and maybe the Americans still had plenty of ammunition, and maybe pushing forward meant losing everything. Red Mahoney sat down hard. Eddie Matsumoto just stared at the gun. Tommy Chen took off his headphones and put his face in his hands. Stanley stood at the gun, hands still on the controls, watching the empty terrain where 6 Panthers had been attacking 30 seconds ago. They'd stopped them. 1 crew, 1 gun, 1 remaining round. They'd stopped them. Hendricks was on the radio, reporting to battalion. When he finished, he walked over to Stanley. His face was pale, hands shaking. 1 round left, if they'd known. They didn't know, sir, that's what mattered. How many tanks did we kill? Stanley thought about it. The math was burned into his brain. 2 confirmed destroyed from this final attack, 1 more damaged, plus the earlier engagements throughout the afternoon. 4 total confirmed kills, 3 probables, multiple assists for the entire day. Jesus Christ! Hendricks sat down. We held this position with 1 gun. 1 gun against German armor all day. Yes, sir, we did. Stanley didn't feel victorious. He felt exhausted, hollowed out. He looked at the burning wrecks scattered across the farmland to the east. Panthers and Panzer IVs turned into funeral pyres. German tank crews who'd just been doing their job, following orders, trying to take back a bridge. Some of them had burned to death. Some had gotten out and been shot. Some were probably still in there, suffocating in the smoke. It was just math, Stanley said. Ballistics and ranges, nothing special. You called every shot perfectly, made every round count. Held that bridge when we had nothing left to hold it with except your skill. Hendricks paused. I'm putting you in for a Bronze Star. Stanley didn't want a medal. He wanted to sleep for 3 days, and then maybe figure out how to stop shaking. But he just said, "Thank you, sir." The war went on. Market Garden ultimately failed. The bridge at Arnhem, 10 miles north, couldn't be taken, but the Nijmegen bridge stayed in Allied hands. British tanks crossed it the next day. The salient into Holland was held. And somewhere in the casualty reports and after-action summaries, there was a notation about Battery C, 80th Airborne Antiaircraft and Antitank Battalion, which had held a critical position with 1 57mm gun and a crew that fought all day on September 21st until they were down to their last round. Stanley Kowalski received his Bronze Star in November 1944. The citation read, "For exceptional skill and courage in the employment of anti-tank weapons against enemy armor during the defense of the Nijmegen bridgehead, resulting in 4 confirmed enemy tanks destroyed and 3 probable kills." It didn't mention the arguments with Lieutenant Hendricks, didn't mention waiting until 480 yards when every instinct screamed to fire earlier, didn't mention the mathematics of armor penetration and the difference between wasting ammunition and making kills. It didn't mention that final round sitting in the ammunition rack, unspent, because the Germans had withdrawn 30 seconds before Stanley would have had to fire it. The war ended in May 1945. Stanley came home to Scranton in August, married Rose Walsh in 1946, got a job at Bethlehem Steel. He worked there for 30 years, never talked about the war. When people asked, he'd just say he'd been in the 82nd, done his job, came home. The Bronze Star stayed in its presentation case in his closet. He never opened it. But sometimes, late at night, Rose would wake up and find Stanley sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and that faraway look in his eyes. When she asked what was wrong, he'd say, "Just thinking." When she asked what about, he'd say, "About ranges and angles, about when to shoot and when to wait." Rose never understood what he meant. Neither did their kids. Stanley never explained. Because how do you explain that you'd held the lives of hundreds of men in your hands based on mathematics? That you'd calculated armor penetration values while German tanks got closer and your commanding officer screamed at you to fire? That you'd made the right calculations and killed enemy soldiers, and even though they were the enemy and even though you were doing your job, you still saw their tanks burning every time you closed your eyes. Some things you carried alone. The weight of precision. The burden of being right when being wrong would have meant catastrophe. The knowledge that you'd made mathematics into life and death, and the math had worked, and men had lived because you'd waited for the perfect range. Stanley Kowalski died in 1987 at age 62. Heart attack at the steel mill. His funeral was attended by family, co-workers, neighbors. The VFW sent an honor guard. They fired a rifle salute and folded the flag and gave it to Rose. Stanley was buried with his Bronze Star and his dog tags. In a cardboard box marked "Army Don't Open," Stanley had left a small leather notebook with his grandson's name written inside, as if he'd always known someone would eventually want to understand. On page 17 of that notebook, he'd written about September 21st, 1944, about critical ammunition shortages and 6 Panthers coming and having to decide the precise moment to fire. Michael Kowalski read that notebook in October 2019 and for the first time understood his grandfather. Understood why the old man had been quiet. Why he'd worked hard for 30 years but never seemed satisfied. Why he'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, thinking about angles and ranges. Because Stanley Kowalski had made the calculation. Had waited when others screamed to shoot. Had fired at precise ranges when safety would have meant firing earlier. Had made every round count through a day of continuous combat. And then, at the very end, had 1 round left that he never had to fire because the Germans withdrew 30 seconds too soon. That kind of responsibility doesn't leave you. Ever. 30 years of honest work at a steel mill couldn't erase it. A good marriage and 3 kids couldn't make you forget. You just learned to live with it, learned to carry it, learned to sit at kitchen tables late at night with whiskey and think about mathematics, and the fact that if the Germans had known you were down to 1 round, they would have kept coming. But they didn't know, and that 1 unspent round in the ammunition rack, that was the bluff that held the line. The notebook is in the 82nd Airborne Division Museum now. Visitors can read page 17. They can see Stanley's Bronze Star. They can look at photographs of him at age 23, standing next to the 57mm of the gun. What they can't see is the weight he carried, the mathematics of life and death. The cold calculation that if he was wrong about range or penetration or timing, hundreds of men would die. The discipline required to wait while tanks got closer. The knowledge that precision matters more than courage, that timing matters more than bravery, and that sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is make everyone wait while death gets closer, because you absolutely know, that waiting is right. Stanley Kowalski knew. And he was right. And it cost him the rest of his life. That's the story. That's what happened. That's what his grandson found in a notebook 75 years later. 1 armor-piercing round remaining. 6 Panther tanks withdrawing. 20 seconds where everything hung in the balance. And a lifetime of sitting at kitchen tables, carrying weight no one else could see. That's the price of precision. That's the burden of mathematics. That's the story of the last shell. The one that was never fired, but saved everything anyway.